File number 1, Echoes in the Forest without BirdSpart 1.1 archive intake, field notes. And the first night classification, internal restricted access repository, Nightroom cold storage. Unit D7, Sable Drawer Originator, Department of Rural Incidents defunct. Box 14, Folder 003. Custodian, MJJ. Hale Freelance Investigator. Credential 4C Date of consolidation, 12 October year withheld audio reference, Reeler 10314 tape. Cassette dub missing leader map index, County Survey Sheet 22B. Grid squares KM912 when the envelope arrived. It smelled faintly of damp leaves and photocopier toner. The return address was a rural post office box that, according to the clerk I phoned later, had never been rented. The postmark had bled into the paper as though the stamp had been pressed on a bruise. Inside lay a single-page memo misfed through an old machine, skewed at a sullen angle bearing a heading I could not authenticate, Rural Incident Bulletin Interim Subj, Forest Quadrant H. Avian Silence Observed Notes, no bird vocalizations for 96 hours. Acoustic floor altered. See attachment status. Hold refer to outside review. There were no attachments. Just a smear of something green sap or ink dragged along the bottom margin as if the page had been slid under a moss door. The memo did not say where Quadrant H was. It did not need to. There's only one forest in that county large enough to be gridded and leaded, a ragged block of state land locals call the lattice for its logging roads, which trace a faded hatchwork over topographic lines. The lattice is a place of ordinary stories, campers lost for an hour, deer season fights, teenagers discovering boredom has velocity, none of which ever made it into a locked drawer. The memo suggested a different kind of story, silence measurable in hours. Silence you could hold up to a clock and watch accrue. When you spend years with archives, you learn to respect absences. A missing label on a tape is not nothing. It is the loudest line of the catalogue. A blank stretch in a deposition transcript is not a gap. It is weight. Silence is content whose delivery system has failed. But birds do not collectively forget how to sing. They vacate, or they die, or they never arrive. The fourth option, what the memo implied, was a kind of erasure. I pulled a county map from my cabinet, penciled a grid, and chose a base town because every investigation needs a place where the coffee is indifferent and the motel carpet is inexplicably damp. The town was called Needle, population uncounted since the last census left their clipboard here and failed to find the road out. There was a diner whose clock had stopped it for 12. The waitress, with a name tag turned blank side out, poured coffee until the surface tension rose like a coin trick. Birds, I said. You're the third this week, she replied, as if counting ghosts. Forest's quiet like a wrong number that keeps calling back. She said a ranger had been by, said other things too, about a fog that burned without smoke and the sound of rain when no rain fell. Locals have a way of using metaphors like bear traps. Step carelessly and you limp out bleeding poetry. I finished the coffee and the rubberized pancake, left cash, and drove north. The road sketched its own reasons. After Needle, the asphalt surrendered to a gravel washboard that taught the car to confess its rattles. The forest approached in hesitant swaths, pine first, then birch like pale knuckles, then an undergrowth of things that do not volunteer names. The lattice has no gate, just a widening of shoulder and a weather-modelled sign with bullet craters counselling, no overnight camping and stay on marked roads, and, lower down, a small rectangle that used to say something, but now said only a scraped-off thought. I parked at a turnout where the map suggested Quadrant H would begin if the grid aligned with the old survey markers. It did not. Forests do not care for graph paper. I sat a moment with the engine off and the windows cracked and thought, listen. The sound in a forest has layers like lacquer. You notice them only when one is missing. Wind in needles, the tick of contracting metal, an insect saw, a jay putting a question mark into the morning, lift, glide, scold, repeat. There was wind, a variable scratch. There was the distant hydraulic sigh of something that might have been a creek and might have been the highway thinking of itself. There was the low thump of my own blood in my ear where the earpiece had once pinched it too long. There were no birds, no chirr, no pip, no to-note insistence of a titmouse, no sycamore laughter of a flicker. The absence was not neutral. It had a temperature, a barometric pressure. I set the recorder on the hood, a good machine, heavy, the kind that forgives damp, and ran a 1 for 3 minutes, pointing east, then a 2 toward the canopy, then a 3 toward the understory. The needles moved without voice. The tape did what tape does, it drank. Field notes: tape log immediate a 1 east, 180 seconds of wind, 1 car at +02, 44, no avian. A 2 canopy, 180 seconds canopy movement. Spectral glance at 1.2 kHz possible mechanical. A 3 understory, 180 seconds. Unknown rhythmic rustle at 0.9 Hz human. Dear, I left the car, pocketed a compass that has always preferred west, and entered the stand. The first thing you learn is the forest's pace is non-negotiable. It moderates ambition. Step, look, breathe. Step, look, measure. A line of flag tape faded orange, scabbed with lichen, ran north, then abruptly ended where a small pine had snapped in a recent storm and taken the ribbon down to the forest floor like a surrender flag. From there, the ground sank into a shallow basin, not quite a bowl, not quite a wound. The air in bowls behaves differently. Sound eddies. 30 yards in, the wind's reach attenuated. Leaves moved in thought, but not in action. At the basin's edge stood a sign. The sign should not have been there at all. It was the wrong color for state wood, pale institutional green, and the wrong font, bureaucratic with an aftertaste of typewriter. 2 screws held it at a slant. It read, "Hold QH, no survey, no inventory report, anomalous acoustics." To the black bar was not paint. It had the quality of something printed and then censored by a hand that had practiced censoring. I rubbed a finger across it and lifted away nothing. The center of the basin, the moss was a brighter green, as if a spill of light had once gone down there and stained it. I walked in with the care of a beginner and knelt. The smell of the ground, the honest chemistry of rot and return seemed less pronounced. Not gone exactly, but folded away. I have an old trick for places like this. Close the eyes and turn the head slowly until the ear finds the least resistance, the acoustic corridor. I found it at northeast, a narrow lane where sound would obey. I whispered there, a syllable that meant nothing but carriage shape, hollow. The word did not return. Specimen bag of contents: 1 clipped sprig of moss, 1 chip of paint from sign green, 1 ribbon fragment, 1 small feather unbanded, downy, grey. Chain of custody, self to self, witnessed by nobody. The feather was a surprise. It lay along the contour of a wet print, 2 ovals, and a drag that suggested a deer had knelt there, perhaps to scratch its neck against a stump, perhaps to perform a ritual deer do not share with men. The grey down would have belonged to a juvenile something. I thought of the memos hours and the math you do when you want not to be wrong. I bagged the feather and wrote a question mark where the species should go. Farther in beyond the basin, the ground lifted and stabilized into ordinary terrain. A logging road, long since shrugged into 2 green ruts, bent around a copse and pointed toward a ridgetop. I followed it until I found the stump the map remembered. On its face, a ring count said, "Older than you think." Someone had hammered a nail into the center and affixed a brass tag, H. That was the letter the memo had offered like a dare. On the back of the tag, in letters so small they must have been struck by a punch, was a word I took to be a joke or a warning or both, echo. I recorded at the stump, just in case the letter turned frequency, and checked the levels. Flat line. A fly wandered the air with the lazy arrogance of a creature that knows it will outlive you. I waited for a robin to prove me wrong. None came. The first voice I heard in the lattice did not belong to me. It sounded from behind, a shape of breath that had found consonants. "You're late," it said. I turned and found a ranger whose uniform had been politely retired by the state, but not by him. He wore the hat with the confidence of a man who believes hats are moral instruments. On his breast pocket, a tin star had been pinned and then blacked with a marker until it looked like a private eclipse. He offered his hand and a name, Auden. He did not offer a badge. Behind him, where he had come from, there was only more forest and a line of air that trembled in the heat like the surface of another kind of water. "Late for what?" I asked. "For the part where you decide you want to leave," he said. "People see the sign and think it's a prank. Then the quiet takes a coin from each pocket, little things you don't notice you're missing, and they go home not knowing they've been robbed." He looked at my recorder the way electricians look at frayed lamps. "It won't help," he said. "Not here. I'm just taking notes," I said, which was true and untrue in equal measure. He pointed at the brass tag. "You find your H," he said. "Good for you. Stands for hush if you ask me." Come on, you'll want to see the culvert. We walked in the manner of men who agree to share a path without sharing reasons. The culvert was a concrete mouth under a service road, square instead of round, built by someone who had a budget and a deadline and neither the time nor inclination to wonder how water feels about corners. Water had chosen not to use it, at least not this summer. The mouth yawned with dry leaves and a smell like old pennies. There were marks around it, a ring of stones stacked to fist height. Black smears where a fire had wanted to happen and had not, and a new sign driven into the gravel with all the bureaucracy a hammer can muster. No entry. Wildlife study enclosure auth. Permit required. Contact. Been there a year, Auden said. Nobody contacts anybody. Phone number's the Western office for the Eastern office of a department that changed its name twice and then died. Enclosure is wrong anyhow. There's no fence but the one you don't see. Birds? I asked. For days, he said. Then 6. Then 3. Not a clean run. It comes back like a man who forgot his wallet. Last week, someone swore they heard a thrush at dawn. Turned out to be a kid whistling from the back of a truck. You want to trap a silence, you put concrete in the ground. I used to think noise was the thing that made us feel modern. Turns out it's the shape the quiet uses to stand in. He crouched and pulled a stick across the dry leaves at the culvert's lip. The sound was mundane and reassuring, like skin on corduroy. He did it again, and the stick left a line that immediately looked older than anything else present. When he stood, his knees regretted it. You didn't hear that, he said. I did. I said, no, he said. With the serene confidence of someone who spends his days arguing with things that cannot sign statements. You remembered it. The hearing part is what's in question. You'll understand tonight. He gave me directions to a logging cabin where I could sleep, then changed his mind and advised the motel in Needle, then changed it again and suggested the back of my car. People living close to anomalies often lose the ability to pick one reality. He finally settled on the cabin with the solemnity of a man selecting a pen for a signature he does not care to give. On my way there, a fog unrolled along the ground. Fog is a Democrat. It embraces without preference. This fog paused at the basin's edge as if obeying a posted law. I watched it hesitate. I am not sentimental about air, but I will tell you. The fog looked briefly embarrassed, like a guest who has arrived at the wrong door and would rather be anything than uninvited. It withdrew toward the culvert and vanished into the square mouth. The leaves stirred in its wake with a sound like a page turned gently. The cabin had been built by a man who knew trees, but not doors. The hinges had been set too close to the frame. The latch had to be charmed with a hip. Inside, a cot, a table, a scatter of National Geographics dated across the transition from optimism to color. I set the recorder on the sill and opened the window. As the light stalled in the pines, the forest performed its audit. It did not add birds. Nightfall in a silent wood feels like a held breath you eventually inherit. The human brain obliges by manufacturing small sounds memory, blood, a house's conversational creaks. I listed them. I heard the scrape of my pencil and the little knock the lead makes when it finds a previously written indentation. I heard the whisper of paper. I did not hear the somnolent argument of owls. I did not hear that companionable negotiation among crickets and frogs whereby they decide whose turn it is to be the background. I thought of the culvert and its square throat swallowing fog hole. Around midnight, the cabin's door made a choice on its own and eased inward half an inch. A pressure shift, nothing more. The window let in a temperature that had decided, after long deliberation, to drop. The recorder's reel turned like a patient clock. I lay on the cot with my boots off and my errors on. At 1:30, the forest delivered a sound I did not have in inventory, a single, high, not avian tone, too pure to be insect, too narrow to be wind against a wire. It lasted the length of a short apology and ended with the curt punctuation of a line plugged into a jack. I marked the time and the approximate frequency and the impulse to pretend I had not been waiting for it. The cabin breathed. The cot found a complaint and aired it. Somewhere on the table, a magazine's glossy page slid against another. In the space where birds should be, something adjusted its chair. Notebook extract 142 tone, 1.2 kHz. Matches a 2 spectral glance source, directional, hard to localize. Nearest edge's door window not implicated aftertone. A sense of having been looked at by the air at 3:07. I fell into that shallow, treacherous sleep archives grant the obsessed. I woke at 04:12, the hour the diner clock had chosen as its maximum, and realized that my notebook lay open to a page I had not turned. The line at the top, written in a hand that was mine, but not my habit, read, "Echo Protocol, do not whistle." I looked at the pencil. It was duller than it had been. The recorder whirred like a comforter. I closed the notebook and opened it again. The line remained, a note to a future self who would be less cavalier. Whistling is a way of pretending to own silence. I pour 1.t first light, which here felt less like light and more like a decision to reduce the darkness. I walked back to the basin. Fog had left a dampness on the moss that made my fingerprints visible for the seconds before they took the hint and disappeared. The sign with the black bar seemed to have been wiped in the night, leaving a smear darker than the paint and shaped like a thumbprint the size of a man's courage. I recorded again. A small, hard insect threw itself into the microphone with the determination of a thing resolving to be noticed in a world newly suspicious of notice. On my way out, I found Orton on the service road, picking gravel from a tread with a stick as if cleaning his teeth. "You'll want to hear your tape before you make any decisions," he said, greeting me without looking up. "What decisions?" I asked. "Where to put the line," he said. "Between what you're willing to call the forest and what you'll agree to call something else. You've already drawn yours," I said. He smiled. The tired smile of a man who has been practicing smiles for visitors who think they invented questions. "I move it every week," he said. "Sometimes I trip over it." Back in Needle, the motel made a wheezing sound as if learning to breathe. I borrowed a desk lamp with a shade the color of nicotine and set up the tape deck. I listened to a 1 of 3 while steam struggled out of the shower and the mirror wrote me a sullen essay on sleep. The reels did not lie. The silence did not crack. At 1:42 on the cabin tape, the tone arrived, clean as claimed. On the spectrograph later, I would see its slender body and peculiar symmetry, a near-perfect sine bearing a thin integer harmonic, like a note teaching a shadow to behave on a 2 canopy. At 00:31, a place I had marked as nothing, there was a faint structure my ear had missed, a splay of energy just above the breath band. Too organized to be leaf and too undecided to be machine. It lasted a quarter second and did not repeat. I looped it and listened until I could convince myself it was the prelude to a bird call that had almost occurred. Almost as a town with interesting laws, I filed my notes, clipped the specimen bag to a hanger by its zip, and spread the map. The brass-tagged stump sat near the gride line between KL 10-11. The basin sat within. The culverts squatted like a geometry lesson. In margin pencil, I wrote H equals hush, hold, hollow, then smaller, echo. When the phone on the motel nightstand rang rotary, black, too heavy to be frivolous, I nearly laughed for the comfort of its audacity. No one had the number. I answered anyway. "You forgot to log your whisper," said the voice. "What whisper?" I said, but the second word fell onto a dead chord. The line went quiet in a way that was not the absence of sound, but its orderly furling. On the wall, the lamp threw up its hands. I put the receiver down as if it were full of water. Outside, the morning had begun. Somewhere there should have been wrens involved in jurisdictional disputes. The parking lot had a lone crow on a post plastic deterrent, bought to move birds along. The crow did its job, it looked away. I wrote the call into the log, boxed it in red, and labeled it with my least favorite word, unconfirmed. Then I took the map, the recorder, the bagged down feather, and the conviction that I was still inside the part of the story where leaving is easy, and I drove back to the sign that told me I would not survey, not inventory, and would certainly eventually report. Grid drift, echo protocol field tests, and the man with the unadopted map classification, internal restricted access repository, Nightroom cold storage. Unit D7 Sable drawer field agent, milliliters. J. Hail credential 4CTY date of continuation, 14 October year withheld associated tape reels, a 7 and 9. Cabin day 2 night 3 auxiliary instruments, barometer analog. Soil thermistor probe, pocket tuning fork, a 440. Carpenter's chalk, 25 meters twine, 3 brass bells graduated. Wax paper envelop Pesnadal at dawn is a city of doors practicing restraint. The diner opened its mouth exactly as the sky learned the color of pewter. The blank name tag on the waitress had rotated a degree, as if someone had given it advice in the night. I ordered the same coffee and the pancake that permitted both knife and apology. Over the counter, a small battery radio murmured weather in a voice that had studied the art of not alarming anyone. fog along the lowlands, a high that would not commit to anything dramatic. When the forecast mentioned birds, it was in a tone reserved for places other than here. Migratory maps, coastal chatter, the civilized noises of elsewhere, Auden arrived without ceremony. He sat across from me as if we'd been meeting here for 30 years. He did not remove his hat. "The quiet's holding," he said, which sounded like praise and diagnosis. He slid a folded sheet across the table, a photocopy of the 1989 survey with a new pen mark drawn where a margin had once enjoyed peace. The mark was an arrow pointing to the penciled phrase mimicry detected. What mimicked? I asked again, though I had already practiced the question in my head and several possible answers in my notebook. "The nearest thing to birdsong that isn't," he said. "We heard it in a ditch pipe west of H. 3 notes, wrong intervals. You don't whistle in there. The culverts get ideas." He watched me stir my coffee and made a face that suggested I was conducting an experiment in too many variables. I told him I wanted to set out apparatus bells, a tuning fork, chalk lines, a controlled kind of invitation to sound. He grunted. "Invite the quiet, it comes dressed as something else. Then we catalogue its wardrobe," I said. He chewed this, then nodded in the reluctant manner of a man consenting to an untidy house guest. "You'll want to see Barlow before you go tinkering," he said. "He's got a map the state wouldn't adopt. Shows the places that refuse to be squares." "Barlow?" I said. "Cartographer. Retired the way stoves retire by warming smaller rooms. Lives behind the hardware store. Smells like linseed." The man with the unadopted map below's workshop was an academic ossuary, dowels in clay pots, paper rolls stacked with the indignation of unframed thoughts, a drafting table scarred by eras that believed in ink. He wore a wool vest with a pencil that had taken up indefinite residence behind his ear. The pencil had learned a little about ears. "You're the one measuring what isn't there," he said by way of welcome. "Absence is a measurement, if the ruler is honest," I answered. "Because some men need you to speak their dialect before they present the interesting objects. The state grids these woods like it means to teach them manners," he said, unhooking a metal clip. "Straight lines, quarterly inventory, the geometry of reassurance. But the forest has preferences. It drifts." He unrolled a sheet. The paper made a sound that satisfied a part of the brain that evolutionary biologists have not yet assigned a function. On the map, the familiar hatch of logging roads tilted in the way old cameras tilt horizons. He had drawn, in a soft pencil, faint isoplex contour lines, not of elevation, but of something else. "Sound pressure anomalies," he said. "Places where the ambient dips without weather's blessing." He tapped quadrant H. "She moves," he said. "A slow breathing. The basin's not where the grid wants it, except when it is." I told them. They nodded the way men nod when they are feeding you the minutes of a meeting they intend to forget. "How do you fix a coordinate on a moving thing?" I asked. "You don't," he said. "You fix yourself and let the thing pass through. Sailors used to do it with stars. We do it with tree lines and culverts with ideas above their station." He slid a smaller sheet toward me. It was a hand-drawn overlay, transparent, with a shape that looked like a mistake and probably wasn't, a crescent nested in a larger, paler crescent, both labeled in a hand that enjoyed making letters. "Hush inner and hush outer. If you stand in the inner crescent too long," he said, "the clocks nearby make friends with 4:12. I showed him my note. He nodded as if a private joke had been given its title at last. "Don't whistle," he said, and I did not ask him how he knew. He sold me the overlay for a promise that I would not ask the state to adopt it. "Maps are posts you put in rivers," he said. "It's unkind to the water." Grid drift armed with Barlow's Crescent, I returned to the turnout. The overlay sat on the county survey like a transparent rumour. The inner hush line confirmed what my ears had learned and my notebook had tried to instruct me to forget. The basin was a kind of lens. On this day, the lens had slid north by a measure that would offend a bureaucrat and delight a child with a magnifying glass. I marked it with chalk on 3 trunks, a ghostly band someone might mistake for lichen. Field notes H lens inner. Soil temp still reading low, 9 to 12 from ambient erratic. Barometer unchanged from needle baseline acoustic floor. -6 dB vs. Last season's county woods average approximate subjective. Breath seems lazy to travel. Vowels feel confiscated. A raven watched my chalking with the professional curiosity of a critic who prefers early drafts. It did not vocalize. I raised a hand to shoo it and realized I was performing an imitation of a partisan gesture from a country I did not live in. The bird pivoted and showed me a wing with a missing primary. I thought about mimicry, about whistling, about the state's box that said wildlife enclosure and meant we hope the quiet behaves. I set the tuning fork on a stump and struck it lightly against my boot heel. The ear rose into the air with the modesty of true things. Sound doesn't travel. It shakes what's already there. In the inner hush, the fork's voice thinned, not muted exactly, but encouraged to mind its own business. I moved to the outer crescent and struck again. The ear thickened as if starch had been added to its solution. At the boundary, a chalk trunk on which I'd written echo because brass tags had made the word fashionable. The fork sang and then, very slightly, did not. The overtone appeared and withdrew like a shy relative at a door. Real 7 tuning fork tests in a crescent, amplitude drop, overtone suppression boundary, transient harmonic plus integer partner matches night 1 tone outer, normal A for furrow, slight flutter wind. Or Woodray speaking? I hung the 3 bells from low branches, small to the north, medium to the east, large to the south. Brass is an honest metal. It narrates its own injuries. I ran twine between them and marked the line at 5-meter increments with carpenter's chalk. A cheap rig, a poem with nails. The plan, let the wind conduct. In an ordinary wood, the bells would tattle on the air. In H, they considered the question. The small bell quivered once without ringing. The large bell gave a single consonant and then developed dignity. The middle bell, embarrassed perhaps, remained bell-shaped and nothing more. I recorded the not ringing. Auden, arriving from whatever dimension produces men in hats at the right sentence, grunted that he liked any experiment that provided negative results you could take home. What you learn from nothing, he said, is almost always the part you would have paid extra for. He reached out and touched the twine. The twine hummed a low, contented note a traveling guitarist might envy. Don't pluck the forest, I said. Who did? He asked, hand already back in his pocket. We walked to the culvert. The crescent of stones had been rearranged again, now a straight line pointing into the square mouth like a directive. A postcard lay atop the gravel. It had a photograph of a lighthouse somewhere too competent for this county. On the back, in tidy capitals, Echo Protocol, Step 3, if unsure, leave a question. The forest answers WHAD you don't ask. No signature. Orton turned it over with a stick. People don't get mail out here, he said. When they do, it's either a bill or a sermon. What's the difference? I said, but he was already squinting into the culvert eye. The phosphorescent streaks had fattened, the way veins do in a forearm when a nurse predicts a needle. Auden put a hand to the concrete and flinched. Cold, he said. Colder than the soil. I stood at the threshold and asked my question without giving it shape. The mouth breathed back a hint of the sine tone from night 1, the 1.2 kilohertz that arrived like etiquette. I wrote nothing in the notebook then as an experiment. If the forest answered what you didn't ask, I would leave this unformed, the listening house Barlow had told me. In an afterthought delivered like a punchline. About a structure deep in the lattice that had never been granted the dignity of a name. A listening house built by surveyors or teenagers, or a man who had decided to go missing and needed architecture to justify his choices for posts. A roof, no walls, a floor that would have been honest if it had not hidden its corners. He sketched it on a napkin at the diner and said, "Don't whistle there." We found it near the outer hush line, on the ridge that imagined itself eastern. The roof had been patched with 3 shingles of 3 different vintages. A raccoon had once lived in the pile of tar paper at the edge and left memoirs in a neat latrine. The floorboards argued with our weight in languages known mostly to their joints. On the rear beam, someone had burned letters with a patient wire, QED. On the beam opposite, QEF. Orton cocked his head. Quod erat, he began. Demonstrandum, I finished. And facet. He smiled like a man who liked to be met where he'd left stations. T. The center of the floor was a circle of nails hammered flush and then painted over with a color that wanted to be municipal green. A child or a scientist with a patient child's heart had drawn radii in pencil, cockeyed but earnest. I recognized the geometry, a do-it-yourself polar plot. The kind of thing you stand at and turn slowly and discover where the air lays down its arms. I set the recorder on the circle and let the reels do what reels do. The listening house rewarded patience with scarcity. Then, precisely when the sun teetered at the roof line, the first artifact arrived, a drop in the acoustic floor so polite it felt rehearsed, followed by a micro-click the tape magnified into meaning. The click was not insect or wood. It was the sound of a circuit consenting to something. On the spectrogram later, the picture would look like a nail tapping a glass from the inside. Electric? Auden asked. Elsewhere, I said, and did not enjoy the melodrama in my voice. We tried the bells again in the listening house, and the small one, choosing a side at last, gave a travelling quiver. The large bell remained stoic. The middle bell, in betrayal, rang a single true note and then pretended innocence. At the edge of that note, braided into its decay, the 1.2 kHz sign winked, the integer harmonic tiptoeing behind as if hoping not to be graded for participation. Reeler 8 Listening House 1741, Acoustic Floor Drop 3 dB. Microclick Event 1742, Middle Bell. Embedded 1.2 kHz sign plus harmonic pair faint 17, 5718, 04, mimicry motif 3 note pattern, distorted intervals, timbre neither avian nor mechanical. Classified quasi-vocal Auden had brought a thermos of something the color of varnished courage. We did not drink it. He held it like an argument he might have later with another version of himself. Mimicry again, he said, and the lighthouse postcard, I said. Step 3, leave a question. So ask one, he said. Not here, I said. Because the circle of nails had an opinion about us, and I didn't want to discover it yet. The question I didn't ask we. Camped the hour between day and a declaration of its opposite on the service road near the culvert. The Ravens too now, deferential, aloof kept counsel in silence on a power line that pretended it had purpose here. The fog rehearsed from the ditches with the ritual of a troop that knows its cue. I removed the wax paper envelope containing the down feather from day one and held it near the culvert's threshold. The air cooled as if we'd moved it across a border. The feather gave the slightest tremble, a hesitation arranged into physics by nerves I could not inventory. On the tape reeler 9, a faint breath rode under the sign tone, not a human exhale, but the idea of exhale taught to concrete. I did not ask my question out loud. I thought it as if it were a narrative I had failed to write. If I whistle, what whistles back? The culvert's mouth cooled another degree. Auden's hand went to the pocket where men keep matches they no longer trust. Don't, he said, and the word took on new job responsibilities in the presence of the square. We waited. Waiting is where archives and woods agree they prefer to outlive you politely. A bat described a sentence along the road and erased it. A vole delivered a footnote to the ditch grass. The ravens considered a wing and then withheld it. At 1843, the culvert issued 3 notes, ascending, uncertain, not ours. Mimicry. The intervals were wrong in a way that felt personal. As if a child had repeated a joke he didn't understand to an audience too kind to correct him. Auden closed his eyes like a man briefly praying, not to a God who fixes things, but to one who turns down the volume. It learns, he said. The culvert. The quiet, he said. Same thing, different coat. We left the bells installed and returned to the cabin by the ridge road that looks like advice from a friend who is often right and always late. On the table, my notebook awaited the ritual of confession. The line echo protocol, do not whistle, had darkened almost imperceptibly. The way pencil does when it is touched by fingers that were thinking of something else. I sat on the cot with my boots still on and felt the day settle on me like a garment I had not been measured for. The tape deck muttered in its loving machinery. I thought of Barlow and his studio calibrating restraint, of the ravens in their abstinence, of Auden practicing the dignity of warnings. I thought, too, of the diner clock 4:12. A number that followed me like a generous stalker, and of the basilisk way the culvert had of making light shy. I wrote in the notebook at last, beneath the protocol line, as if obeying step 3, question unasked aloud, who taught the culvert intervals? I boxed it and then, irrationally, turned the page as if hiding it from an audience. That was me, on the sill. The recorder's red light glowed with the ethics of an ember. Wind found the pine's argument. The forest handled night the way an accountant handles decimals. We waited together for the hour when clocks in this county rehearse for 12, and the listening house, miles behind us, decides whether to host another microclick. A small punctuation mark in the book of absence. When I finally lay back, my body wrote out a letter its joints could sign. The room deepened into the quiet's preferred geometry. From the direction of quadrant H, though directions inside are hush, as suggestions came the smallest of promises. A filament of tone at 1.2 kHz, weaving itself through the window screen with the courtesy of a visitor who wipes his shoes. I did not whistle. Protocol breach, the fourth tone, and notes left in silent seclasificon, internal restricted access repository, Nightroom cold storage. Unit D7 Sable Drawer Field Agent milliliters. J. Hail Credential 4CTY Date of Continuation 15 October Year withheld associated tape reels a 10 or 12. Cabin Night 4. Auxiliary instruments 2 handheld parabolic microphones. Carbon paper 16mm cine camera wind up. Pocket compass faulty 3 wax candles. They arrived reluctantly, pale as if it had negotiated a smaller contract with the sun. I walked from the cabin toward the basin with Auden a step behind, his boots performing the rhythm of someone who had outlived several explanations. The ravens did not appear this morning. Their absence had a weight equal to their silence. The bells I'd left along the hush boundary had rearranged themselves overnight, the twine sagged, but none had snapped. The small bell lay on the ground, not fallen but unhooked, placed deliberately on its side. I logged this with the suspicion one reserves for a chess opponent who moves pieces after leaving the room. The recorder caught nothing unusual except for the sound of my own pencil. But the air in the basin pressed more firmly on the chest. As though the lungs had applied for permits, the fourth to neat 1013, the culvert produced a sound we had not catalogued, 4 notes in a descending stare, each sharper than the last, intervals so exact they mocked the mimicry motif. Unlike the earlier whistle's fragile, wrong, childish, this sequence carried intention, a deliberate architecture of sound. The pitch hovered above the known sine tone, closer to 2 point for KHZ. I placed the parabolic microphone against the culvert's mouth. The tone re-emerged faintly, as if rehearsed for an audience already seated. Auden frowned. "Not ours," he said. "Not theirs either." Later spectrographic analysis revealed what he is only half noticed. Each of the 4 notes bore a shadow, a faint doubled line exactly 1.2 kHz below the main frequency. The original sign had become an undertone, like a tutor following a student's pen. Reel a 10 culvert morning 1013, 4-note motif. Descending, precise shadow undertone at -1.2 kHz. Persistent duration, 6.3 seconds, amplitude steady. No environmental core seeth basin moss shimmered faintly after the sequence, though the sky remained stubbornly unreflective. I clipped a sample and sealed it, but the bag fogged instantly, as though carrying breath. Protocol breach be afternoon, fatigue encouraged disobedience. I returned alone to the listening house, leaving Auden at the turnout with instructions to note any vehicular arrivals. The nails in the circles still glinted under dust, patient as commandments. I stood at the center and considered the line in my notebook, "Do not whistle." Some commands begged their opposite. The quiet had learned mimicry. The culvert had adopted intervals. If the experiment required a trespass, I would file the violation under necessary. I pursed my lips and let out a short, ordinary whistle, 3 notes, the kind of call a man uses to summon a dog. The sound traveled an inch, then fractured. On the tape reel at 11, the waveform collapsed into interference to simultaneous signals, mine truncated and another stretched. The second whistle continued longer than breath would allow, bending upward in pitch until it became indistinguishable from the forest's own tone. The listening house responded physically. Dust lifted from the beams in small size, and one nail in the circle twisted minutely, as though iron had remembered it was malleable. My chest felt briefly emptied, alone collected without paperwork. When the sound ceased, I wrote in the notebook, "Protocol breach." Subject whistled. Response extended mimic, structural tremor, ein twist. I returned to Auden, who knew without asking. "Your face," he said, "looks like it's been listening to a sermon that ended before the collection plate." He refused to hear the whistle playback. "Some things you don't rerun." The stranger with the ledger that evening at the diner, a man I had not seen before, sat 2 stools away. He carried a black ledger bound in cloth and ordered nothing. His hand smelled faintly of carbon paper, a scent archivists recognize as both record and erasure. When he left, a slip of onion skin paper remained under my cup. Typed neatly in courier font, the message read, "Echo Protocol Step 4 if you break the rule. Admit it. Silence punishes denial more than confession." The waitress cleared the counter without noticing the note. I pocketed it with the shame of a student concealing a failing grade. Cabin night 4 back. At the cabin, I prepared a double recording rig, reel-to-reel on the sill, parabolic, pointed through the window. I lit 3 candles, one at each corner of the table, leaving the 4th corner empty. The absence became a participant. At T019, the tape caught the 4-note motif again, this time outside the culvert's context. It emerged from the tree line, carried not on air but through wood. The beams in the cabin trembled faintly. The candles bent their flames east. Then, impossibly, my own whistle replayed, slowed, deepened, carried by a throat the forest had borrowed. The mimicry was exact in rhythm, distorted in everything else. The undertone 1, 2 kHz pulsed beneath it, steady as a metronome. I wrote the confession line in my notebook. Yes, I whistled. The graphite broke mid-word. When I sharpened it, the stub fell and rolled under the cot. I left it there. AT247 and knock sounded 2 raps, hesitant. Unlike the confident triple from night 2, this was experimental, as if whatever knocked was uncertain of etiquette. I did not answer. The recorder spun dutifully, a clerk signing minutes. BY311, the candles expired one by one, not from draft, but as though their wicks had tired. The final flame stretched, split into 2 tongues, and vanished. In the after darkness, the tone persisted. Reel a 12 cabin night for 019, 4-note motif. Source tree line, cabin beams resonance 021, replayed whistle slowed. Distorted, undertone sustained 247, 2 knocks. Amplitude consistent, source unlocalized 311, flame event. Tone persistence 38 sec notebook extracts admitted breach. Protocol step for satisfied. Silence after confession less punitive. Subjective pressure eased. Forest may demand honesty as participation fee. Next step, uncertain. Anticipate step 5. When dawn arrived, the ravens returned, 2 on the power line, 1 on the post, each silent, each watching. Their wings caught the weak light and fractured it. For the first time in days, I felt the weight on the lungs lessen. The forest seemed briefly content, but the page of the notebook, the one bearing my confession, had altered overnight. The words "yes" I whistled had been underlined in a hand not mine. The line was drawn with perfect mechanical pressure, identical to a typewriter underscore. I closed the notebook, uncertain whether admission had absolved or merely advanced me to the next rule. Step 5, the borrowed birds, and a hole in the hour classification, internal restricted access repository, Nightroom cold storage, Unit D7 Sable Draw Field Agent, milliliters. J. Hail credential for CTY date of continuation, 16 October. Year withheld associated tape reels, a 13 of 15. Cabin Day 5 Field Auxiliary Instruments, portable speaker archival grade, reel-to-reel dub of regional birdsong 1974, metronome wind up, Masonite soundboard, carpenter's chalk, hand. Tally counter, black ledger borrowed, and signed morning arrived like a sentence missing its verb. The ravens were present, 3 this time, stationed with military indifference along the power line that ends nowhere and powers less. They were still, not silent exactly. Silence felt too deliberate for them, but resolved to let the air do all the talking. On the diner counter, under the coffee's small weather front, lay another onion skin slip, courier font, carbon soft around the letters as if the words had been whispered to the ribbon. Echo Protocol Step 5 Return what you borrowed. If nothing was borrowed, offer a substitute. I read it twice and understood immediately why my lungs felt lighter after the confession. I had borrowed a rule from the quiet and snapped it. I'd paid interest. Now the forest wanted something back. If I had taken nothing, no chickadee call, no robins anxious descending, then I should bring a placeholder. Offer a substitute. I called Barlow from the payphone whose throat had forgotten how to ring. He answered as if he'd been listening to the line itself and not the bell. You've got step 5, he said, sparing me the dance. What have you got to return? Birdsong, I said. On tape. Good, he said. But don't feed it the present. Give it history. The old birds before traffic taught them to sing above engines. I thought of a box in my trunk, a library dub made from a 1974 field album, prairie and oak hammock voices printed to acetate when the county still believed in brochures. I'd brought it as comparison, never as tribute. Where? I asked. Not at the culvert, he said. It eats what you love. Try the listening house. Its mouth is older, then gentler. Take Auden. Borrowed birds, we carried the dub and a small speaker wrapped in an oilcloth like contraband. Auden wore a look I'd come to recognize, the face a man makes when the rule he lives by has been more useful than true. He said little, letting the forest assemble around our decision. At the listening house, the light made its usual bargain with the roof. The circle of nails regarded us with municipal patience. I set the speaker on the Masonite soundboard, wound the metronome, and tuned my expectation down a half step. The reel complained into motion 197 for hiss, a damped room tone not from any room. The first track was a Carolina wren, cheerful, local, the sound that turns porches into auditoriums. The tape delivered to measures and then skipped, not mechanically, but as if the forest had placed a finger on the phrase and held it to the light. On a 13, the wren's call stood up straight, then learned to bow. Harmonics peeped where none had lived on the original. The undertone of familiar 1.2 kHz ghost threaded through the wren's spine like wire. The listening house floor tightened. The circle of nails looked newly minted. We played a robin, then a thrush. The thrushy's fluted algebra made the roof breathe. I realized with an archivist's shame that I loved the thrush more on tape than I had in trees. I wrote that down because I trust paper to accept confessions without correcting me. Reel a 13 listening house playback track 1 Carolina wren, spectral graft with -1.2 kHz undertone. Non-original shimmer. Floorboards tense track to American robin, partial acceptance. Echo returns with altered contour. Tone persists. Track 3 wood thrush, roof resonance. Subjective time dilation see below at the third track's midpoint. My watch eased, not stopped eased. The second hand developed charity. Minutes reconsidered their goals. I looked to Auden. He held his wrist up like a witness. 4:12, he said softly, though the watch read 10:09. He didn't mean the hour. He meant the gravity. The hush had opened a familiar hole. We let the thrush finish. The house sighed the way old houses sigh when memories leave, grateful and afraid. Do we owe it the whole tape? Auden asked, voice smaller. No, I said. We owe it a gesture. It knows the difference between a gift and a tithe. I rewound 10 seconds and played them again. The forest declined to accept a duplicate, offer a substitute. I switched to a Bob White's clean whistle. The house did not care for it. The undertone persisted, unimpressed. Try the wrong season, Auden said, surprising me. Give it a spring in October. Let it decide. I dialed to a spring chorus, frogs and peepers angling for romance with a determination bordering on theology. For the first time in our days, the undertone thinned. The 1.2 kHz sign retreated into its hole like a ruler who had learned humility. I wrote a line I did not expect to write. The quiet prefers a choir. We ended with a minute of plain wind in tall grass, recorded by a man who'd known pines personally. It felt right, then presumptuous, then right again. The house relaxed by a noise floor. Returned enough? Auden asked. I waited. The nails didn't twist. The roof stayed out of the conversation. 10 seconds became 10. Enough, I said. A hole in the outback at the basin. The chalk lines I'd drawn to mark the inner hush had slid again northwest now, a body turning in sleep. The sign's black bar had widened by a hair, the kind of growth only bureaucrats and fungi attempt. Below it, the ghost of letters. Inventory. The forest had laughed once. We walked the grid with Barlow's overlay. The inner crescent's edge had bitten a new tree-fresh scratch, wet sap. I placed my palm against the wound. The sap was cold. Not forest morning cold, but draw in a morgue cold. I jerked back and shook my hand like a man refusing a handshake from a future he hadn't earned. Time's thin here, Auden said. You can feel where it gets chewed. He wasn't wrong. My watch resumed its charity. I made a tick mark at 11:02 on the tally counter and waited a minute, counted, and found I had gained 2 ticks without living through them. The hush had built a small annex and let me in rent-free. Field notes. Time anomaly location, in a hush edge and any quadrant instrument, mechanical watch hail, tally counter manual effect, minute equals 70 to sec 48 sec variable, subjective intermittently elastic hypothesis, undertone field modulates timekeeping. By dragging oscillators seek 1.2 kHz. Metaphor, not mechanism. It is dangerous to give anomalies mechanisms. They breed comfort. I wrote metaphor only 3 times in red. At the culvert, the phosphorescent streaks had congealed into a diagram of nothing I recognized. Not letters, not numbers, not spores. Auden, who had chosen to know less than he could, looked away. Step 5's done, he said. Don't feed it step 6 before it asks, which is? I asked. Whatever costs, he said. The ledger, the stranger's ledger, the black cloth book he'd carried through the diner like a compact library waited on my cabin table when I returned, placed with such care it took my breath to inventory how many things had been moved to accommodate it. The candles sat precisely where I had left them, yet their ash cups had been made empty. The window latch wore a fingerprint the size of a borrowed thought. The ledger's cover bore no title, just a small impressed rectangle as if a label had retired. Inside, ruled pages, careful columns, dates in a hand devoted to symmetry. The first entries predated the 1989 survey and ran forward through a handful of years, then stopped, then resumed in a new ink someone else, or the same hand pretending to be another. Excerpts transcribed, April 3rd, first day no birds in H. Wind line holds. Culvert hum present faint, April 7th, mimicry attempted, poor intervals. Listening house floor nails resist, August 19th, brought back thrush on tape. House softened. QED beam warmer, November 12th, whistled in error. Day spent returning what I borrowed, undated, different ink. A man came who walks like he's carrying a drawer. I told him not to whistle. He will. I closed the ledger gently the way one closes an eye. Either I had been written a decade before I arrived, or the forest had adopted my biography, or time had acquired a taste for recursion. I felt anger at the ledger's author for knowing me well enough in a sentence to predict my trespass. Then, softer, gratitude for leaving a record of how to survive it. At the back of the ledger, in a pocket where you keep receipts you hope accountants will forgive, a card, heavy paper, embossed, a seal that belonged to no state I recognized. Nightroom cold storage unit D7. My repository, my drawer, the return address I had given no one. On the reverse, a line, leave it better than you found it. It felt like an accusation until it felt like a rule. Bells again, we walked the boundary once more at dusk to reclaim the bells. The small bell, hung where I had left it that morning, though I had not hung it. The twine was taut. Each chalk mark on the line bore a tiny nick, as if a careful beak had tested the measure. I brought the small bell to my ear and knocked it with fingernail. It gave a thin, perfect note. I said, not for 140, 1.2 kilohertz. A bell tuned to the undertone, or the undertone tuned to the bell. I could not say which was the predator. We took the bells down and wrapped them in cloth and silence. Auden carried them like instruments and like evidence. If a man sues the quiet, he said, does he win allowed a life? You'd represent the quiet, I said. I'd settle out of court, he said, and we both stood there longer than necessary, letting a joke end at a humane size. The hour that chewed at 1938 by diner time, Needles Main Street turned its face toward the wrong kind of evening. We sat in my car and listened without tape to how a place sounds when the night arrives with paperwork. The blank name tag waitress propped the door and looked at the sky as if waiting to be introduced to it again. A dog somewhere attempted a howl and produced a dry cough, then, mortified, pretended to have always been interested in a park tire. We did not see the moment it happened so much as discover that it had. The hour chewed. The traffic light at the single intersection stalled on yellow and stayed there, not broken, paused. The neon open sign in the barber's, which had not hosted a head in a decade, flickered into a thought and out. My watch, which had become a rumor in these woods, lifted its second hand a notch every other breath dot in that gnawing. The four-note motif sounded again far from the culvert. The undertone followed, thread through fabric. I had the sudden certainty you get before weather. If we had not brought the birds, the owl would have gone hungry for something else. Return what you borrowed, Auden said. Almost as prayer, we did, I said. Keep doing it, he said. A pickup rolled to a polite stop at the yellow light and waited for permission from a color that had abdicated. The driver looked down at his lap as if remembering a list. The ravens, which did not belong to our civic arrangements, chose the moment to leave the power line one at a time. Arrows released in 3 degrees of intention, and crossed the boulevard's empty sky like punctuation you add after revising a sentence. What we offer at that night cabin day 5, which contained more minutes than consented, we made a plain broadcast. We didn't return to the listening house. We addressed the basin itself. The speaker stood on the chalked in a line, as if speaking in a county courtroom whose judge had opinions about shoes. We played the grasswind again, the spring frogs, the thrush for only a breath. The recorder drank with better appetite. Somewhere inside the moss, a pressure eased. The undertone reduced itself to etiquette. My lungs behaved like lungs. Borrowed birds returned, I wrote. Substitute accepted. For now, on a 15, a new and smaller thing appeared at the tape's edge, so small I might have missed it if not for the ledger's note about nails and their stubbornness. A flutter, not mechanical. 3 syllables of air arranged into a suggestion. Not a call. A preface. The forest clearing its throat. We stopped the tape there. I have learned to leave first sentences alone until they come back wanting friends. T the door. As if the protocol had been skillfully staffed. A final slip of onion skin fluttered against the threshold. Caught in a draft, reluctant to admit it was message and not trash. Echo Protocol Step 6, learn to leave. Then come back different. I held the paper and felt a pressure at the back of my sinuses, the kind that comes before weather shifts or tears. It knows we'll stay, I said. No, Orton said, kind again. It hopes you'll go while you still remember where going is. He looked at the forest as a man might look at a house he'd built and moved out of and still mows. Tomorrow we draw a line, he said. Between H and a road that won't follow you home, I said, and the birds, he said, and here his voice did something I will not mimic. If they return, they'll bring a different word for morning. If they don't, we will have given the quiet a thing that teaches it how to end. I left the ledger on the table, closed. I left the bells unhung. I left the notebook open to step 6 and did not write anything under it. I slept the way you sleep after an apology accepted but not acknowledged, somewhere in the basin. 3 notes, wrong and new, practiced themselves, failed politely, and failed a little less, the line we drew, a voice in the ledger. And the last morning without birds classification, internal restricted access repository, Nightroom cold storage. Unit D7 Sable Drawer Field Agent, milliliters. J. Hail Credential 4CTY Date of Continuation, 17 October year withheld associated tape reels, a 16 or 18. Field, Cabin Night 6. Auxiliary instruments, fluorescent survey, chalk blue. Pocket compass misaligned, disposable Polaroid camera, ledger cloth bound, unclaimed, brass bell stowed during the Lyneth protocol slip had been clear, learn to leave. Auden interpreted it not as retreat but as cartography. We'll give it a border, he said, so that leaving feels like respect instead of desertion. At dawn, fog surrendered early. We carried survey chalk and a compass that no longer pointed to magnetic north but to some in a preference of its own. We marked a crude perimeter around quadrant H, not in straight grids, but in a crescent, echoing Barlow's overlay. Each tree received a stripe of blue chalk. Each stripe looked temporary, the way writing on skin looks temporary. I took Polaroids as we walked. The camera complained about light but delivered images anyway. Each frame showed the chalk brighter than paint, as if it had phosphoresced under duress. Orton stuffed the pictures in his jacket. Evidence, he said, or postcards. At noon, when we closed the crescent, the air shifted. The undertone dipped by half, audible even to untrained ears. The basin exhaled, not in relief, but in recognition. It had been given a shape, Realer 16 boundary marking 1158, undertone decrease 5 dB 1202, anomalous gust along chalk line. Inward, duration 9 seconds 1210, faint 3-note motif ascending. Incomplete, the voice in the ledger back at the cabin. The ledger opened itself to a new page. Not literally the wind had done the muscle work, but the ink had already appeared. The line is good. It holds until it doesn't. Tomorrow they will test the edges. Tomorrow you will be asked whether you know the difference between listening and answering. The handwriting was the same balanced hand that had predicted my whistle. But beneath it, faint as watermarks, another script appeared, typeset, as if a press had touched the paper invisibly. Its words, Nightroom entry draw D7 file incomplete. I touched the page and felt the low static of a phone left off its hook. Orton did not ask to see. He said, every archive eventually writes back. The question is whether you file its reply. The culvert at dusk, we went once more to the culvert, not because we wanted to, but because rules have magnetism. The stones had abandoned their crescent, their line, their compass rose. They lay scattered, as if a child had tired of pattern. The culvert hummed faintly, a throat rehearsing scales. At 1912, the 4-note motif emerged again, descending this time, decisive. The undertone did not follow. In its place, a faint trill like wings striking air. Borrowed birds, Auden whispered. It's trying. On tape reeler 17, the trill registers as both avian and not. Waveform jagged, interval strained. A robin misremembered, a thrush with vowels missing. Yet it was effort, a gesture toward the thing absence had been practicing. Fog seeped from the culvert mouth, not outward but inward, retreating like breath held too long. The phosphorescent streaks dimmed. For the first time in days, the mouth looked only like concrete. Cabin night 6 at the cabin, we kept vigil. The bells remained wrapped. The notebook lay open to step 6. I wrote nothing. Waiting was its own text. AT103 and knock sounded again 3 this time, confident. I opened the door. No fog, no raven. Just the forest, dark but not predatory. The air carried a single sound, one bird, tentative, perched beyond sight. It gave a call like a draft, not full song, but enough. The recorder caught it, 3 syllables, tonal, avian in timbre but warped by the undertones old grammar. On spectrogram reeler 18 it looks like handwriting trying to imitate type. I wept, though briefly, because professionalism is a suit you can't wear in every room. The last morning without birds we woke to a sky unambitious, grey but kind. The ravens had gone. In their place, smaller silhouettes perched on the diner's eaves. They did not sing. They regarded. The waitress's name tag now bore faint letters, though not legible. Her clock still fixed at 4:12, but the coffee steamed warmer. She poured without looking. Anything different? She asked. Not yet, I said. But Auden corrected me. Different is what it does best, he said. On the drive out, near the basin's edge, a single note rang clear, high, fragile. Not the undertone. Not the mimicry. A new bird or the quiet practicing resurrection. I stopped the car, listened. The note repeated, then faltered, then laughed at itself the way wrens do when morning is theirs alone. Notebook extracts boundary line accepted temporary. Ledger writes without ink. File incomplete. Undertone absent during 4-note motif. Substitution. Trill avian attempt. Step 6 acknowledged. Leaving is lesson. Return uncertain. When I filed the day's notes, I found the ledger had already catalogued them in neater script. My words edited for brevity. As if the archive wanted the record tidy before it slept, I left the cabin with the sense that something had ended, though it had ended as beginnings do, unconvincingly. Leaving by staying, the survey that wasn't. And what the Raven brought back: classification, internal restricted access repository, Nightroom cold storage. Unit D7 Sable Drawer Field Agent milliliters. J. Hail Credential 4CTY Date of Continuation 18 October Year withheld associated tape reels a 19/21. Boundary Walks Cabin Day 6. Auxiliary Instruments Pocket Barometer. Twin metronomes wind up. 2 mason jars sterile. Colored survey chalk blue. Reapplication. Carpenter's grease pencil. Ledger cloth bound. Polaroid remaining for shots. Hand counter, Raven primary specimen B. Returned, wax string, envelope onion skin. Learn to leave without going. Step 6 had read like advice from a doctor who won't sit down. Learn to leave then come back different. Auden invested in the practical. Translated, we'll act as if we've gone. We will change the terms under which we remain. He proposed a boundary ritual not in ceremony but in work. Reapply the chalk, remove instruments, empty the cabin of attractive questions. If the quiet eats what we love, he said, we'll stop feeding it our favorite parts. We started at the diner because leaving begins with coffee and a receipt. The waitress had almost a truly generous, almost written a letter on her name tag. It might have been an E or the promise of one. The clock continued to advertise for 12 like an old campaign poster for a defeated hour. Outside, the eaves hosted 3 silhouettes, not raven, not yet wren, a kind of punctuation. The morning wasn't ready to pass. T. The turnout. We opened the trunk and packed our curiosity. The bells went away first. The tuning fork back into its velvet coffin. The parabolic MICs nested like intent in intent. We left only 2 metronomes and a single mason jar of ordinary air. Leaving the least you can measure, I said. Auden, liking the sentence more than he admitted, said nothing. We walked the blue crescent and refreshed its stripes. Chalk leaves a dignity on bark that paint does not. It promises to go away on its own. At each tree we paused exactly long enough to hear nothing, then moved. Leaving, Auden said, the word gaining weight through repetition. Is sometimes how you stop arriving. Real and 19 boundary reapplication undertone, present 12 dB vs. Day 1 stable. No deepening at chalk, wind, normal, finally indifferent, subjective pressure, reduced at inner arc. Increased briefly at Western Hook note. Hook intersects old Skid Road on the Western Hook. We found an artifact we hadn't left, a survey stake. Fresh cut, painted with state orange, stamped DPI or new transect in letters that didn't belong to this county's budget. A brass cap bore the date of 3 days from now. The future had surveyed without us. Somebody opened a file, Orton said, or resurrected one. He removed the stake with the fastidiousness of a man tidying up after a guest he cannot afford to insult. Under it, a hole not dug but present, as if the ground had declined to participate in the stake's plan. Inside the hole, a small twist of wax string and the corner of an onion skin envelope. I lifted the envelope corner free. No note yet. A blank address to later. Protocol's growing handwriting. I said, or you're learning to read what was always there. Orton answered, the survey that wasn't Ballo heard about the stake before I phoned him. People like him keep their own weather maps. He arrived at the turnout with a rolled sheet under his arm and the kind of excitement you hide behind complaints. They are coming, he announced, meaning no one and everyone. He unrolled a map, not of H but of everything around it. Roads, tax lines, a pale wash indicating watersheds, 2 counties with grudges. Overlaid so faint you needed to trust his pencil were corridors of drift. Arrows that suggested where the hush might go when it grew bored of us. They'll transect here, he said, tapping the Western Hook, the exact place the undertone had briefly thickened. Because they're instruments like straight lines. They'll get numbers they can't repeat and call it an equipment failure. Then they'll widen the budget request until the problem looks profitable. He took a breath and did not look at me when he added, they'll try to fix it. Can it be fixed? I asked. It can be respected, he said. Fixing is what you do to a bicycle chain. The hush is a climate. You weather it. We took him to the listening house because some places do half the explaining. He stood on the circle of nails, closed his eyes, and did not whistle. The house rewarded him by remaining timber. On a 20 the floor gave a fractional sigh at 17, 13 no undertone, no mimicry, just wood being wood. A control returning to its position. Barlow nodded as if the house's restraint had proved a moral point he'd been trying to make to me for years we hadn't known each other. Good, he said. You are leaving well. What the raven brought back at dusk the ravens returned with ceremony. 3 as before, but now one wore a new geometry. The missing primary specimen B's echo had been replaced patched by a narrower feather of odd sheen. It caught light as if the light had been told to behave. The altered raven dropped to the boundary line near the culvert, not crossing, and placed an object with an unmistakable intention, a ring of wax, shaped by a steady hand. Embedded in the ring 3 threads of chalk, blue, caught like notes on a staff. It hopped back and watched us with the expression of a juror who already knows the verdict. I knelt. The ring's wax was warm, though the shade had already colonized the ditch. In its surface, tiny striations like the whorls of a fingerprint, too regular to be our own. I set the ring on the Masonite soundboard and let the tape drink the silence around it. The recorder captured a change I would only recognize later with patience, a minute attenuation of the undertone in a radius of 1 step. Gift? I said. Receipt, Orton said. For the birds you returned. We did not take the ring across the line. We set it on the chalk and left it to decide where it belonged. The ravens approved by practicing not speaking. 2 metronomists at the cabin I wound both metronomes to the same tempo 60. The unit courtesy grants itself and started them together. In a healthy room they will drift apart and find each other, like strangers taught a dance. In the hush they behaved like siblings who've agreed to disagree, sync for a minute, then scandalously out. Then as if catching themselves back into benevolent alignment, reel at 21. Cabin synchrony 0001, 22, phase drift to 14001, 2303, 40, spontaneous ray sync at 0341, and elastic drift periodic, undertone absent during ray sync windows clocks making treaties, I wrote. Leaving may be the treaty's subject. I placed the Raven primary from night 2 beside the ledger. It looked smaller. Either it had dried or memory had. I returned it to the envelope and wrote on the flap, returned. The word looked self-important until it looked correct, the ledger's voice again. The ledger opened at a fresh blank and populated itself with a paragraph that arrived in sentence lengths, as if spoken and only later convinced into print. When you remove the instruments, the forest learns it is not an exam. When you close the cabin, the quiet remembers. It does not need to host. When you leave while remaining, H forgets to keep you. Tomorrow it will test whether you can stand on your side of the chalk while it sings on its side. Below, in very small type, a bureaucratic feint, Nightroom entry D7 status, provisionally stabli had never seen my repository declare a status. This was the archive writing its own minute. I initialed the margin like a civil servant because sometimes dignity is a ritual, not a fact. The surveyors arrive almost toward midnight. Headlights combed the service road, paused at the culvert, and shut off. Voices, too, young, not locals. The state contracts in vowels. They walked to the mouth, stopped short of the chalk, and exhaled the guilt of boys who think their flashlights can negotiate with night. We're not here, one said. Imagining that sentences make documents disappear, the other lifted a tripod and then lowered it without attaching anything. The culvert held its breath. The undertone now a rumor did not reward them. They stood, listened to their own listening, and left with the ceremonial care of thieves. Returning a sugar bowl, Auden and I remained inside the dark, where it prefers to keep its friends. They'll be back, he said. So will we, I said, the sentence not meaning what sentences usually mean. A small morning preliminary morning approached as if the night had asked it nicely. We went to the basin with nothing to measure but ears. We stood on our side of the line, hands at our sides, like citizens posing for a school photograph. They will later deny. For a full minute the forest did nothing more than be itself. Then the sound came, not a chorus. That would have been a relapse into nostalgia. A single bird from inside the hush, practicing a scale no field guide has printed. Up 3 notes, down 2, hesitate, a small trill, stop. The third ascent found a contour we recognized, thrush, like without courage, and held it just long enough to count. We did not cross. The chalk remained a promise we kept to the letter, if not the spirit. The bird kept to its side. After the 5th attempt, the undertone thinned until it could be mistaken for the electricity inside your own skull when you lie very still and miss someone. I wrote the word morning in the notebook and did not underline it. Auden removed his hat because there are times when you do not want your head speaking for you. The bird stopped. The hush closed like a patient book. The basin breathed once. We left slowly, our leaving a lesson we did not want to pass. Notes, addenda, small instruments mason jar number 1 air, in a crescent, odor of wet stone, faint metal. Barometer inside jar unchanged. Later opened outdoors, undertone reappeared briefly at mouth. Metronomes, pack away. Ray run only after border test complete. Raven wax ring, left in situ. Status to be checked at dusk. Polaroids, 3 frames left. Save for evidence of first undisputed song. Stake hole, refill with native soil. Leave onion skin envelope, corner in place. If note populates, transcribe, do not remove. Echo protocol working gloss, notice. 2 refrain. 3 question indirect. 4 confess. 5 return substitute. 6 leave. Anticipated 7 receive unconfirmed. 8 record without custody opening parenthesis speculative closing parenthesis dot at the end of the day. The ledger accepted 1 more line. Not in its clean hand, but in a script that looked like wood grain taught to write. A song practiced at the border is still a song. I closed the book and heard inside its covers the gentle tap of a nail deciding not to twist. Border test. A borrowed morning and step 7 unconfirmed classification, internal restricted access repository, Nightroom cold storage. Unit D7 Sable drawer field agent, milliliters. J. Hail credential 4CTY date of continuation, 18-19 October year withheld associated tape reels, a 22-24. Boundary test night 7. Auxiliary instruments, none deliberate abstention. Polaroid 3 shots remaining, ledger cloth bound, chalk blue. Mason jar number 1 air, in a crescent. Wax ring ravens, pocket watch fickle. Patience renewed the rings who at dusk we returned to the culvert boundary to check the raven's wax ring. The road had acquired the moral quiet of places that expect witnesses. The ring sat where we'd left it, gathering none of the usual grit. It seemed to repel dust, as if the air had been taught courtesy in a radius the size of a palm. Within the wax, the 3 threads of our chalk had bled faintly outward, blue migrating like dye through fabric. You ever see wax do that? I asked. In churches, Auden said. On feast days, we did not move the ring. Leaving means resisting tidiness. I took a Polaroid of it flash off, natural light which the camera resented but did not veto. When the square developed in my hand, the ring appeared brighter than the world around it, haloed with a dim, particulate haze that wasn't on the ground. The haze formed a nearly perfect circle, the size of a small bird's reach. The hush practicing geometry, I said, the hush practicing nests. Auden corrected, on a 22 because I had allowed myself one indulgence. I rolled exactly 60 seconds of tape from a safe distance. The reel captured almost nothing, a drop in the undertone for 6 beats, then a soft 3-syllable flutter, too low for a wren, too careful for a thrush. The wax ring did not change shape. The air did. The onion skin writes we crossed to the western hook, where the state stake had dreamed of 3 days hence. In the hole, the onion skin corner we had left as a placeholder had become itself, a note, populated in precise courier, an office voice that had spent its life inside Manila. Echo Protocol Step 7 Provisional, receive without owning, hear without capture. Do not inventory this gift. Beneath, a smaller line typed with irregular pressure, as if the ribbon had been turned by a tired hand. If you file it, it leaves. Auden read it once and then behaved as if he had not. He doesn't traffic in metaphysics. He traffics in days. But even days accept new bylaws. We can stand and listen, he said. We can't put it in a drawer. You make that sound easy, I said. That's why we practice, he said. We replaced the corner without taking the whole note. We smoothed the disturbed soil with the back of my notebook, which grumbled about its new role and accepted it. Border test. The test was plain. We would return to the inner crescent at first light with no instruments, no questions, and no designs on memory. The chalk line would stand. We would not cross. If the forest sang, we would remain exactly ourselves and do nothing but be the size of citizens, not obliged by arriving on schedule, if not in temperament. The undertone, spared our appetite for it, labored on at the baseline hum of an old fluorescent light in a hallway with bad policy. We slept in shifts in the cabin with the window open, as if the house desired a breeze and humility. At TO5, 42 an hour, the county still remembered how to count. A faint call reached us from H, an upward flick, a comma, then a little laugh. The laugh was wrong and not wrong, an echo of Wren stuttered and mispronounced. The ledger on the table did not write. I took this as approval. We walked down at 6:01 with hands empty, pockets bored. The chalk line glowed the way objects glow when the eye has convinced itself that attention is a kind of light. We stood less than a boot length from it and became furniture. What came next consumed no tape and yet built a record in the ribcage. A bird, small by silhouette, practiced from within H's skein of notes, like someone threading beads in low light. Up 2, down 1, a half step that cheats, a trill that thinks better of itself. It paused after each phrase, as if checking the fit against a pattern only it could see. The undertone did not underwrite this song. It diminished to the kind of electrical rumor you can convince yourself is the blood in your ear for 3 minutes, not 93 seconds as it had liked before. The bird kept at it, each attempt braver toward birdness and less like the culverts arithmetic. Then, quietly, as if apologizing for success, it fell silent. The basin did not inhale. It allowed us to. Step 7, I said, unconfirmed. Auden said automatically, but his hat was in his hands. We did not applaud. Praise mortgage is a thing. We nodded the minimum amount humans can nod while remaining mammals. Barlow's postscript below arrived mid-morning with a thermos and a map rolled like an invitation to a party with too many rules. We showed him the chalk, the ring still halation bright, and the holes typewritten ethic. He squinted at the courier letters like a man tempted to edit the foreman's report. Receive without owning, he read aloud. That's the line museums spend their lives trying to learn. He unrolled a fresh overlay. It mapped not roads or drift, but admissions, the places we had confessed and the places we had refrained. The listening house wore a small star. The culvert, an X with a ring drawn around it like a worn teenager's weekend. The basin, 2 crescents inner and outer, annotated, began and begins again. You brought a word back to the map, he said. Morning. I told him what we'd heard without nouns. He understood it anyway, the way trained people hear the parts you can't speak. Good, he said. Now leave. We are, I said. Leave more, he said gently. The last instrument living means theft's opposite. We returned to the cabin and removed what knowledge appreciates. The ledger we left. It belongs to the drawer that found us. The wax ring we left. It belongs to the boundary that made it. The onion skin we left. It belongs to correspondence with an author. We don't get to subpoena. Only one thing tempted me, the raven. Primary Specimen B, which I had already returned in an envelope stamped by my own handwriting. I opened the envelope and found, as happens with beatitudes disguised as office work, that it now held 2 feathers, the original and a slimmer, darker twin, whose iridescence had learned a new color. I did not bag it. I did not measure it. I placed the envelope under a stone at the boundary, a cache for an animal who might require trophies to narrate itself. The stone warmed briefly. Auden pretended not to see. We closed the cabin the way you close a book for someone else to open, leaving an index ribbon where a human hand would naturally reach. On the sill, the metronomes now unwound rested at the same angle, pendulums centered, arguments suspended. The watch in my pocket resumed accuracy, which felt like cruelty, and then, kindly, like grace. The culvert turns ordinary when a miracle stops daily. It considers a career change. We went to the culvert one last time, not for ceremony, but to confirm whether the square throat had rejoined its species. The phosphorescent streaks had freckled into nothing. The concrete smelled merely mineral. The 4-note motif did not arrive. The mouth felt like weather and civil engineering dot in the ditch. A pool I had never seen caught sky the color of something stainless. A mayfly wrote its single argument and signed nothing. A frog plain frog, without archive, pushed a small V and forgot to be symbolic. Good, Orton said. It can be a culvert again. What if it misses its old job? I asked. It gets promotions in other counties, he said. That's how climates work. We chalk no survey on the outer edge out of sentiment, not instruction. The old sign with the black bar had tilted further, entering its late life comedy. The bar flaked at one corner, where water and time had conspired with indifference. Under the flake, the original ink finally let go a syllable, invent. We left it half-born, the ledger's final paragraph for now. Back in the cabin for the last time singularly ours, we found the ledger open to a page that bore a paragraph neither of us had written and both of us had been trying to learn. A record kept without custody is a kind of weather report, true enough to warn, humble enough to miss. Today the basin rehearsed a word not printed in 1989. Tomorrow, nobody will grade it. If you return, do so with fewer pockets. Below, stamped in the faint type the ledger preferred when it wanted to sound official without being authoritarian, Nightroom entry D7 file status, open. Do not close. I initialed the corner out of habit. Then I erased my initials, because ownership is a habit too. The borrowed morning we went once more to the boundary at what the county called 708. The chalk had paled. Dew had conspired to erase us kindly. The wax ring's halo remained, subtle as breath on glass. Across the line, a movement, the small silhouette returning to its practice. It sang, if sing can be applied to a thing that is both prototype and prayer. And then without so much drama as a feather crossed the line, .it landed on the outer crescent. Precisely within the ring of air the Polaroid had revealed. It cocked its head at us, not as supplicant and not as suspect. The beak opened. The trill arrived without undertone. This time, for 5 notes, it was not wrong at all. A Renzidium, revised by an editor with mercy. We did not breathe for the length of those notes. When we breathed, the bird did not punish us for it. It finished the phrase, invented a smaller one like a thank you for patience, and lifted back over the line with the ease of a deed recorded correctly. Auden's eyes watered the way men's eyes water in wind. That's all, he said softly, which meant more than enough. We did not take a picture. That would have been a draw. We did not roll tape. That would have been a claim. We did not step across and invite the hush to clarify. We let the section end where all good sections end, a period, plainly placed, followed by white space dense with implication, packing the silence we drove to needle. The diner's door made no case for itself. It opened as doors open. The clock did not move from for 12 because no one had ever asked it to. The waitress's tag now bore a name I cannot, in this record, write. It is not mine to own. She poured coffee and said, the crows are back to being loud. She smiled in a way that forgave them and would not last. That is the nature of mornings. Barlow, at the far stool, sketched a circle on a napkin and labeled it with the letter H because professionals refuse nostalgia, the comfort of calligraphy. He pushed the napkin toward me with the side of his hand. You'll file? He asked, which in his mouth meant, you'll write without stealing? I'll leave it open, I said. Good, he said. Open is where weather goes. Auden, hat brim low, accepted none of this theatre as payment for what he had done, which was keep a place exactly the size of itself while agencies lined their pens. He He said he would watch the chalk fade and the stake holes fill and the culvert assume its bureaucracy again. He would listen for mornings that mispronounced themselves into meaning. We paid in cash because receipts are the paper trail of guilt. And we liked our guilt smaller that day. Nightroom noted in the motel room, the one that had taught the lamp to be yellower by night, the black rotary phone did not ring. I lifted the receiver anyway, just to hear the faithful absence. On the table, I stacked the few sheets that could stand being stacked. The first memo, skewed. The onion skins. 2 Polaroids, the wax ring, and a tree with blue chalk like a bruise. A single copy of Barlow's overlay. My notebook with "Do Not Whistle" still darker than anything else. I wrote a cover slip in a hand a clerk would bless. Nightroom cold storage unit D7 sable drawer. File, echoes in the forest without birds. Status, open do not close notes, receive without owning. Border holds for now. Morning attempting itself, I did nodded the bird. There are entries that cannot carry ink. Afterward at the line we went one last time, not because of romance but because rituals deserve exits. The chalk had faded into bark. The wax ring had softened into the ground. The hole where the onion skin lived had grown a tuft of grass that had not been there yesterday. The culvert was already rumour. The basin's moss, when pressed with 2 fingers, printed the brief oval of this investigator's existence and then, decently forgot, on our side of the line, we said nothing. On its side, a small body inhabited a branch and practiced 5 notes without requiring witnesses. Then it stopped, as if electing a future in which songs are not chores. We left the road as roads are left, by driving away without story. In the rear view, the forest exercised its right to be background. Auden lifted a hand and set it down. Barlow's map, rolled in the footwell, tapped my boot as if remembering a step. If there is a step 8, it did not write itself on paper. It placed itself in the act of not taking. It let the chalk fade, the ledger shut, the drawer remain open. I slept that night in a city far enough away for birds to be municipal again. At for 12, as if the diner clock had syndicated its joke, I woke to a single thread of sound outside the window, Iran ordinary and entire, rewriting morning into its preferred grammar. I did not record it. I did not even count the notes. I let it pass through, the way weather passes through a room with windows designed by a man who trusted Ed. In the morning. I mailed the file to cold storage with a label the ledger had preemptively approved. On the back of the envelope, in pencil, a sentence I have learned not to underline. A song practiced at the border is still a song, the silence beyond the line. Visitors with measuring sticks, and the forest's memory classification, internal restricted access repository, Nightroom cold storage. Unit D7 sable drawer field agent, milliliters. J. Hail credential 4CTY date of continuation, 20 October year withheld associated tape reels, a 25/27. Boundary encounters cabin day 8. Auxiliary instruments, none deliberate abstention. Polaroid 2 frames left, ledger cloth bound. Grease pencil for margin notes only, human memory fallible, but consented silence beyond the line for 2 days we had resisted instruments. The chalk faded at its own pace. We didn't refresh it. The wax ring had melted into earth. The basin carried itself like a child pretending not to enjoy a secret. We stood at the outer crescent each dawn with nothing but lungs and the patience to let a sound happen. On the 3rd morning, nothing came. No mimicry, no undertone, no bird rehearsing. Courage. Just the honest ordinary, whined through pine, insects practicing for auditions they would never win, the distant complaint of a truck on the highway. It was almost enough to believe the hush had closed itself like a file finally approved, but Auden, arms folded, hat low, muttered, "This is when it remembers." He was right. At 7:41, from well inside the hush, a sound emerged. Not avian, not mechanical, something else. The closest comparison was water force through a reed, but the rhythm carried intention. A phrase, paused, repeated. 4 times, "Not for us," I whispered. "Not yet," Auden said. He lifted a hand as though greeting something he hoped wouldn't wave back. Visitors with measuring sticks by midday. The sound of engines along the service road cut the stillness. 2 state trucks, white with decals fading from too many summers, parked at the turnout. 4 people in vests and hats spilled out, carrying measuring sticks, a GPS unit, and the tired laughter of employees obeying orders they didn't write. We watched from the cabin porch, Auden chewing the inside of his cheek like a man measuring a sermon. They marched toward the culvert, chatting loudly to keep their courage from filing grievances. The chalk line already ghostly slowed them only because one bent to tie a boot. None acknowledged it. They set the tripod and spooled cables and aimed a small dish at the basin. "Wrong dish," Auden muttered. "They're listening the way you watch television through the wrong end of binoculars on a 25, which I cheated by running for once, hidden in my jacket." The tape recorded their voices, one female clipped vowels, one male humming tunelessly to drown nerves, two younger murmuring acronyms like incantations. The forest gave them nothing. Undertone absent, mimicry absent, only wind loyal to its own job. After 20 minutes they packed up, confused, but careful not to call it confusion. Before leaving, one hammered a stake near the ditch. On the brass cap, "Survey void." The word void was factory stamped, not added. They left it gleaming like an accidental warning. Barlow, when told, said only, "That's their way of pretending they didn't try. We photographed the stake anyway." Polaroid frame number 2. The picture developed grainy, with a faint shadow not visible in real time, a small bird silhouette perched on the stake. No bird had been there. The forest's memory that night. The ledger spoke again, not in its clean bureaucratic script, but in handwriting jittered like aftershocks. When others measure, age pretends amnesia. When you leave instruments behind, it remembers. Memory is not storage. It is rehearsal. Do not confuse the two. Beneath, typed in faint courier, Nightroom entry D7 status, memory active. Words felt heavier than classification, as if the file itself had been made self-aware. I wrote in my notebook, "Archive has begun to remember itself." Dangerous. Then softer underlined or comforting. A small return at 2:03. The undertone returned, not strong, but present. It thrummed through the floorboards of the cabin like a heartbeat too polite to announce itself. I opened the window, expecting fog. None came. Instead, a bird call, one note, pure, almost ordinary, threaded the silence. It came from beyond the chalk, from inside the hush, but it belonged to no mimicry I knew. It was not practicing anymore. It was returning on a 26. The note is plain. On spectrogram, though, it carries a faint doubled line, not the old undertone at 1.2 kHz, but an overtone above, faint, ghost-like, suggesting the bird had learned to balance two voices at once. A duet with its own absence. I wrote in the ledger margin, a song practicing itself into memory. The ink bled sideways, as though the page wanted more room. The raven again at dawn. The ravens came back, for now. The patched one carried a strip of paper in its beak. It dropped it on the chalk line and retreated without flair. Onion skin again. Courier font, faint as if typed on a ribbon. Tired of secrets, step 7 continued, when the forest returns a song. Do not claim it. Listen and leave. Auden picked it up, held it to the light, and exhaled slowly. "It's giving homework," he said. "The kind that grades you later." The day without undertone. For the first time since the memo had found my post box, the undertone abandoned us for a full day. The hush seemed lighter, easier to walk in, as if gravity had taken the weekend off. Even Auden's boots made ordinary sounds: leather, gravel, fatigue. The culvert smelled only of wet leaves. The listening house creaked when we leaned against its beams, but no longer threatened to twist nails. The absence of anomaly was its own anomaly. My notebook filled with lines like, "Is this the forest leaving us? Or us leaving correctly?" That night I dreamt of the diner clock. It moved at last, ticking 1 minute forward, then stopping again. 4:13. When I woke, the cabin clock agreed, though it had no reason to. On a 27, my breathing is audible, steady, human. In the background, faintly, impossibly, the sound of wings. The day the clock moved, a choir with one throat. And how to keep an open filler classification, internal restricted access repository, Nightroom cold storage. Unit D7 Sable Drawer Field Agent Milliliters. J. Hail Credential 4CTY Date of Continuation 21-22 October Year with held associated tape reels a 28-30. Boundary Vigil Cabin Night 9. Auxiliary instruments, none abstention maintained. Ledger cloth bound. Pocket watch behaving. Polaroid 1 frame remaining. 2 envelopes onion skin. A patience that knows names. The day the clock moved morning obliged with a plain sky and the polite temperature of a town that has learned to keep its drama out back. We took coffee in the diner and didn't look directly at the wall clock. Attention changes outcomes. We had learned that. The waitress poured. The doorbell failed to announce a man who had become furniture. When we finally allowed ourselves one glance, the hands had edged forward. 4:13, Orton saw it too. He saluted the minute as if it were a flag that had just remembered wind. There, he said. We're not stuck, or we're stuck somewhere else, I said, because pessimism is a way of rationing hope. He shook his head. The hush releases what you stop hoarding. We stopped hoarding minutes. We left cash and a note that said nothing and returned to the line by a road that had agreed to be road-like for one more season. The chalk had softened, a bruise resolving. The wax ring was soil now, but the circle of air it had invented remained the size of a bird's courage. A choir with one throat we stood with our hands emptied. No tape, no dish, no promises. We couldn't afford. At 7:19, from the inner crescent, the single voice resumed its practice. Not mimicry, not echo. Attempt. Up 3, down 2, a quick trill that threatened to be joy, and then thought better of it. The sound had body now. It pushed air like a hand on a door, politely insistent. Then something happened that made the ribs consider their architecture. A second voice, almost, but not quite the same, arrived a measure behind the first thin, tentative, harmonically adjacent rather than aligned. It was not a duet so much as a shadow trying on its subject's shoes. I felt my throat answer with that involuntary hush the human body uses to avoid scaring what it loves. 2, I whispered. 1 and its memory, Orton said. He removed his hat and did not look at me. The second voice failed, recovered, triangulated a note 2 half steps off correctness and held it with a pride I could respect. Then both fell quiet, like students catching the scent of supervision. We did nothing. That was the assignment. The visitors returned with a script by noon. The trucks returned, this time with an additional man whose vest carried an insignia stitched by a committee. He had the clipboard posture of someone paid to argue with phenomena. They approached the culvert with their tripod, their small dish, their script, the kind of script that persuades grant panels that weather can be made to submit. We watched from a responsible distance, no tape running. The man with the insignia spoke loudly about baseline and replicability. The others aimed the dish the way a person who has never learned patience aims questions. Inside the culvert, mineral, memory, bureaucracy. The mouth gave them nothing. The basin withheld its rehearsal. Even the wind took a lunch break. Again, the man said, like a magician who believes in hats more than rabbits. They tried again. The dish blinked its small LED. The cable obeyed gravity. The clipboard recorded a crime scene of non-events. Then, as if the county wanted to save them from a memo, a crow, a living, loud municipal crow, landed on the dish and cawed in the man's ear with a work ethic I admired. The crew laughed the laugh you used to release a room from embarrassment. They packed up. As they left, the insignia man planted a stake at the road edge. Its cap stamped, monitoring discontinued. I took that as the state's version of confession. Barlow appeared out of heat shimmers with a map he had amended while we thought we were watching the road. He marked the stake's coordinates, drew a small square around the culvert, and wrote lead in tiny letters. Government documents prefer declaratives. His maps prefer verbs. Ledger interlude, an index for what we didn't target. A ledger had learned our hours. It lay open on the cabin table, casual as a cat, to an index page that had not existed the day prior. Index of emissions, a recording of first correct note not captured. B photograph of bird crossing line not taken. C spectrogram of to voice attempt not generated. D sample of wax ring halo air not collected. E name of waitress not entered. Beneath, in courier, Nightroom guidance. Leave entries you cannot keep without changing them. I wrote F. Minutes between for 12 and for 13 not owned. The graphite felt sturdier than virtue. The listening house remembers the bells. We visited the listening house after a long avoidance, carrying nothing but our bad knees. The circle of nails had oxidized a little in the changes of weather we had given it. In the rafters, a strand of spider silk held a leaf as if signing a line. The house creaked once when we stepped onto the circle, and then delightfully stayed structure. We spoke a word we had not permitted ourselves. Thank you. The house didn't answer. Buildings are good at boundaries. A TR exit. Something glinted behind the rear beam. The smallest of brass sounds, a vibration at the edge of hearing. One of the bell clappers, how had it arrived here? Hung from a nail by a strand of wax string, moving a millimeter in the house's breath. It did not ring. It did not need to. The memory of ringing sufficed. We left it as found. The ledger had made us cautious about generosity that photographs too well. The diner's new minute-way tested our leaving in town. At dusk, the neon buzzed in the barber's window like a retired insect. The waitress's name tag bore letters now, all of them, but I will not put them in this file. That is the difference between record and robbery. On the wall, the clock developed ambition for 14. Patron saint of small increments. Watch over us. Tomorrow will be 4:15, I said. Tomorrow will be somewhere else, Orton said. And we both pretended the sentence didn't mean more than miles. Barlow toasted the minute with the kind of thermos that had been on boats. Your file will stay open? He asked. It has to, I said. Closure is a lie that makes cabinets feel successful. He grinned. I like your lies better than theirs. The Forest's memory test that night, call it night 9, we performed the only test step 7 allows. We listened for what we would refuse to inventory. We sat with the window open, ledger shut, breath made less obnoxious by folding it into longer shapes. The undertone did not return. The two-voice attempt did. The second voice held a little longer, as if the grammar of being bird had moved from worksheet to speech. Then, so faint the air needed training to notice, a third syllable arrived, not separate, but braided into the first overtone, undertone, with tone. Not harmony, thickening. The Forest adding body to its pronoun. 3, I whispered. Still one throat, Orton said. Just wider. We slept in intervals that felt ethical. In the morning, the basin let us stand without asking for identification. The envelope under stone returning to the western hook, we found the onion skin corner replaced by a whole envelope, sand-flavored, addressed in courier to nobody, echo protocol addendum if a song crosses. Let it. If ID stays, leave first. I looked at Orton in the way partners in crimes not punishable by law look at one another. We don't get to keep mornings, he said. We get to make room. We slid the envelope back under stone, our side this time. A gesture that felt like agreeing to rules older than property. Practice. At the Lineat 706, the small body appeared again at the chalk that had by now become more idea than mineral. It landed within the ghost of the wax circle and did not look for permission. The beak opened, and the note that had been trying to be a note achieved itself in 5 steps. Not spectacular. Not the kind of thing that would sell calendars. Just bird. We stood as still as a photograph you would regret taking. The call repeated once, and in the repeat, for the first time since the memo and the culvert and the listening house and the ledger's bureaucratic miracles, there was no trace of the undertone. No 1.2 kilohertz spine to carry it. It held on its own bones. The second voice did not arrive. We did not require it. A choir with one throat is still a choir if the silence agrees to be audience. The bird crossed back into H and left us to tally nothing. My hand twitched toward my pocket, where a recorder had not been for days. I let the muscle learn a new reflex. What we told each other and didn't, Barlow said. Some things you fix by not fixing them. He folded the overlay with the crescents and slid it into a map tube as if tucking a child. I'll update it with a circle where a circle wants to be, Orton said to the Forest. Not to me. I will mow your edges with a look. He meant he would be present. Guardianship is attendance, not fences. I said nothing because I recognized the exact size of my voice. The ledger later found a sentence I had forgotten to say and wrote it in my hand. We kept an open file and it kept us. I will not argue with a book that can do that trick. The last Polaroid not taken, I carried the camera in my bag, 1 frame left. The wax ring had taught me that photographs can become doors. I walked to the line intending to make a door and stopped at the chalk, which had chosen to migrate into metaphor. The small body moved in the branches, unafraid of adjectives. I put the camera away. The not photograph darkened in the ledger's index of emissions later that night, as if entries could congratulate themselves. A letter to the drawee wrote a cover slip on cheap paper that dignified the act by accepting ink without smearing to Nightroom cold storage. Unit D7 Sable Drawer Subj Echoes in the Forest Without Birds Part 5 Concluding Note Summary State Surveyors Discontinued Monitoring. Border Ritual Sustained. Undertone absent during song. 2 voice attempt observed. 3rd syllable with tone noted. Protocol Step 7 Receive without owning in practice. No specimens removed. No images of bird. File remains open by necessity and by ethics. Underneath I added in pencil, because pencils are honest about revision, if you read this, leave space for what we didn't bring you. I did not underline it. Underlining is ownership. The The day after, the Minuteway returned to the diner to see whether time had learned manners. The clock read for 15 and did not apologize. The waitress's name tag shone like a revelation I would never write. She poured coffee strong as law and said, "Quieter out there last night." Then, "Softer, but not empty, not empty," I agreed. And that phrase felt like the kind of prayer the county might allow at public meetings. Orton raised his cup without performance. Barlow sketched a small bird on the napkin the way cartographers bless the blank, a silhouette, not a species. We paid and left and allowed the road to lead us in the direction that made leaving feel less like absence and more like room. Night note, how to keep an open file in the cabin. Before we collapsed our day into sleep, the ledger wrote one more time without waiting for us. An open file is the promise to return without the right to collect. Keep the drawer unlocked. Let the next song decide whether it wants paper. Below, a status line that looked like a heartbeat on a monitor that had chosen to be patient. Nightroom entry D7 status, open. Listening. I initialed and erased again. A ritual that had become education. We blew out the candle we had not lit, closed the window we had left open, and learned the lesson. Step 7 had been muttering since Onion's skin began typing itself. We could go now. The bird did not sing that night. That was all right. Choirs need silence to tune to. The basin at rest, letters without senders, and the forest's bargain classification, internal restricted access repository, Nightroom cold storage. Unit D7 Sable Drawer Field Agent Milliliters. J. Hail Credential 4CTY Date of Continuation 23 October Year withheld associated tape reels a 31 of 33. Final Boundary Walks Cabin Night 10 Auxiliary Instruments None strict abstention. Ledger cloth bound, Polaroid unused. Barometer unpacked but silent, 2 candles unlit. Patience of ending the basin at rest for the first time since this file began. The hush carried itself without drama. The moss no longer shimmered, the undertone no longer stalked our ribs, and the culvert no longer practiced scales. It was not empty. Forests resist emptiness the way lungs resist stillness, but it had chosen to be ordinary. We walked the crescent chalk, which had faded into the bark until it looked like birthmarks on trees. Nothing twisted, nothing rehearsed. The only anomaly was the lack of anomaly, and even that began to feel natural. Orton bent, touched soil, rubbed it between finger and thumb, and said, "It's remembering how to be dirt." His voice carried satisfaction and grief in equal measure. On a 31, I let the reel turn for half an hour. It captured wind, insect, the faint scrape of my pencil, human intrusions. No undertone. The tape, once crowded with strangeness, sounded like a childhood field trip no one had bothered to document. I wrote, "The forest rests. We must let it, letters without senders back." At the cabin, 2 envelopes waited on the table. Onion skin, courier font. Neither had been there when we left. The first read, Echo Protocol closing remarks provisional if you leave. Leave quietly. If you stay, stay small. The drawer is open until ID isn't. The second envelope was blank outside. Inside, folded once, a single page of ledger paper with my own handwriting, except I had not written it. You came to needle carrying instruments. You will leave carrying memory. Do not mistake them. Memory leaks. Let it. If you return as someone who does not expect archives to wait for him. Orton read both, handed them back, and said, "It's grading your exam. You passed because you stopped answering questions." I didn't argue. A visit from Barlow arrived near dusk with a map tube under one arm and fatigue under the other. He laid the tube on the table and screwed the cap and slid out the overlay. Not paper this time. Vellum, hand-inked, careful. He had drawn 3 crescents, the outer, the inner, and a third, thinner arc beyond both. He tapped it with his finger. This appeared after you stopped measuring. The quiet is growing polite. It doesn't erase your work. It expands on it. That's the bargain. What does it mean? I asked. That it remembers differently than you do. And that's enough. He refused coffee, left after 15 minutes, and told us to lock the cabin door one last time. Not because it would keep anything out, but because it would teach us how to leave. The ledgers bargained that night. The ledger filled half a page on its own. The script looked weary but firm. Archives bargained by subtraction. You gave up sound, images, trophies. In return, you received a word rehearsing itself toward morning. Keep the bargain. Write only what you can forget. Forget only what you would have written. Below, the bureaucratic line, Nightroom entry 7 status, open, pending exit for the first time. The word exit had appeared in any of its stamps. I underlined it once and shut the book before it could change its mind. The basin's gift at 3:27. We woke to a sound. Not the undertone. Not mimicry. Not the rehearsed duet. A single bird, close, perched on the sill. Its call was small, clumsy, incomplete, but it was real. No spectral doubling, no false overtone, no forest ventriloquism. It left behind a feather, plain brown, unremarkable. No iridescence, no phosphorescence, just bird. Auden picked it up, held it to the light, and said, "This is the gift, not the song, the ordinary." I placed the feather between notebook pages and immediately regretted it. Step 7 had warned me, receive without owning. I removed it, set it on the sill, and let the wind take it. It lifted easily, found a draft, and disappeared toward the basin on a 32. The recorder captured only my hands opening and closing. As though embarrassed to be hands, the forest's bargain be dawn. The hush had taken on the timbre of every other forest in the county. Birds, real birds, unborrowed, began their noisy negotiations with light. Jays screamed about property, sparrows debated etiquette, crows jeered at nothing. The basin had rejoined the republic of mornings. We stood at the line and listened, not for anomalies, but for the ordinary choir. It was overwhelming. After so many days of curated silence, the chatter of birds felt like riot, like revolution. "This is what we asked for," I said. "This is what it asked of us," Auden corrected. Notes toward an exit culvert silent. Marks erased. Functions again as water's bureaucracy. Listening house, stable. Nails rusting naturally. Circle intact but passive. Ledger, still writing. File stamped pending exit. Diner clock for 16. Name tag fully legible, not recorded here. Ravens, absent. Perhaps employed elsewhere. Feather, not kept. Left to air. Protocol, steps 1-7 observed. Step 8 unwritten. I wrote in my notebook, last line of the page, we leave tomorrow. The drawer remains open. The last night's candles, unlit for days, guttered once, as if remembering their profession. We did not touch them. We let the night pass unmeasured. The forest offered no more tricks, no more rehearsals. Just insects, owls, wind. The sound of the world refusing to be mystery and succeeding by accident. When I closed my eyes, I heard the single bird's imperfect note replay itself, not on tape, not in imagination, but in memory's throat. I did not write it down. That was the bargain. Exit interview, the road away, and a drawer left open. Classification, internal restricted access repository, Nightroom cold storage. Unit D7 Sable drawer field agent, milliliters. J. Hale credential 4CTY date of continuation, 24 October year withheld associated tape reels, a 34 a 36. Final cabin closure departure auxiliary instruments, ledger cloth bound. 1 envelope onion skin, blank, Polaroid unused, expired. Notebook graphite depleted, patience of endinjexed interviewmening arrived without ceremony. The forest sounded like forests do when they remember themselves, alive, messy, without agenda. Jays bickered. Sparrows quarreled with air. Even the diner's dog barked at a truck with the dedication of employment. On the cabin table, the ledger lay open to a page already half filled. Not in my hand. Not in Auden's. It looked like a transcript of an interview I did not recall giving. Question: why did you come? Answer: to find what wasn't there. Question: what did you take? Answer: less than I wanted. More than I should. Question: what will you file? Answer: the gap. Question: who speaks for the birds? Answer: their absence until they return. Below, stamped faintly, Nightroom entry D7 status, exit initiated. The ledger closed itself. Dust rose, settled. Auden, hat in hand, said, "That's as close as you'll get to a handshake." Closing the cabinway packed nothing that wasn't ours. Instruments gone. Bells left. Feather released. Ledger to remain. The cabin looked smaller without questions inside it. Its walls carried only Wood's memory, not undertones, not mimicry. I wiped the table with the sleeve of my jacket, not to clean, but to erase the shape of our elbows. The key, left on the sill, gleamed briefly as if metal had learned gratitude. We did not lock the door. Locks are ownership. We let the door rest against its frame, balanced between open and closed, as archives prefer. On a 34, the tape caught 30 seconds of ordinary silence. The kind of silence cabins make when they anticipate new tenants. The road away we drove south. The road behaved as roads do. Gravel, ruts, decisions. The trees did not lean inward. The sky did not collapse. The undertones stayed absent. For once, leaving felt like leaving. T the diner, the clock said for 17. The waitress poured coffee. Her name tag was legible. I will not write it here. That belongs to her, not to the file. Barlow arrived in time to nod. He placed an envelope on the counter, heavy paper, blank outside. Inside, a map without marks. To remind you that not everything needs drawing, he said. He refused payment, left coins on the counter anyway. Will you keep watching? I asked. Always, he said. But watching doesn't mean owning. It means being here when it needs eyes. Auden raised his cup in agreement, drank, and said nothing. Nightroom packet at the post office, a building older than its mail. We assembled the file. Notebook pages. Onion skin slips. 2 Polaroids. Cover sheet written in a hand that didn't trust permanence. On the back, 1 line in pencil. Open files don't close. They wait. I sealed it, marked to Nightroom cold storage, Unit D7. The clerk stamped it without curiosity. On a 35, I recorded the sound of the envelope sliding into the outgoing bin. It sounded like nothing. It sounded like completion disguised as transit. The forest's Goodby and the road out of Needle, the basin invisible behind trees. A sound reached us through the open car window. A single note, clean, correct. Bird, not mimicry, not undertone. Just itself. It did not repeat. It did not need to. Auden smiled without showing teeth. That's goodbye, he said. Or hello, if we ever come back. I did not write it down. Some things belong to memory unmeasured. The last reel that night, in a motel 2 counties away, I threaded a 36, the final reel, into the recorder. 30 minutes of nothing extraordinary, cars on wet asphalt, the tick of a bad lamp, my own tired breathing. But at 04:12, because of course the reel caught something faint, a bird outside the window, practicing 3 notes, then stopping. As if embarrassed by its own confidence, the spectrogram later showed no undertone, no overtone, no spectral anomalies. Just bird, ordinary bird. The miracle was its plainness. I labeled the reel, a 36 final open. I did not box it. I let it sit on the desk and spooled slightly because open files deserve air. Exit notes protocol steps observed. 1-7 complete. Step 8 unwritten. File remains open. Ledger status, exit initiated, open pending future. Artifacts, all left in situ. Witnesses, Auden present, Barlow adjunct. Author's note, the forest gave back birds. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Addendum, the drawer. And when I closed my eyes, I imagined the drawer in cold storage, the sable drawer waiting. Not shut, not locked. Waiting the way forests wait for light, the way minutes wait to be noticed. Inside, the file would rest, open, incomplete, correct in its incompleteness. A drawer left open is not negligence. It is invitation. I wrote one final line, not in notebook, not in ledger, but in the margin of memory. A song practiced at the border became a song. Then I slept.